The very last box I taped up was filled with photos of my son when he was a little boy. Denise was leaning against the bedroom door frame, arms crossed, watching me with cold, detached eyes. Her gaze felt like a ticking stopwatch. 11 days. George. That's exactly how long it took for my son Luther's wife to decide there was no longer any room for me in the house, his hard work paid for, right after we laid him to rest. My name is Kesha Kirkland. I'm 68 years old. Up until 3 weeks ago, I had a son, a daughter-in-law, and a beautiful home where I thought I'd spend my Sundays and live out my golden years. George. Now all I have left are 2 large suitcases, a random folding chair left behind in the garage, and a daughter-in-law looking down her nose at me. Her posture made it seem like I was a burden overstaying my welcome, rather than a grieving mother who had just buried her only child. I'm not trying to be cold, Kesha, Denise said. George. Her voice was smooth and perfectly measured, a line clearly rehearsed 1,000 times in her head. It's just, we all need to move forward. We need to go in different directions. Behind her, her mother, Sylvia, lingered in the hallway like a ghost. Sylvia's arms were crossed even tighter than her daughter's, and she didn't say a word. George. But in a traditional Southern African American family like ours, that kind of silence carries a massive weight. Every time Denise's tone softened even a fraction, Sylvia's eyes would narrow dangerously, like a harsh director grading an actress on her performance. It's only been 11 days, Denise, I said, looking her dead in the eye. You couldn't even give me 30? George. The house needs room to breathe, she replied coldly. You understand that, right? I didn't understand. The only thing I understood was that ever since the funeral, Sylvia had taken over the kitchen, intentionally muttering complaints just loud enough for me to hear. George. The only thing I understood was that somewhere between the wake and the reading of a very basic will, I had become a piece of unwanted, leftover furniture. I hauled the last heavy box to the trunk of my Honda Accord all by myself. Nobody offered to help. Sylvia stood on the porch, watching me like a debt collector, ensuring every single cent was accounted for. George. I backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching loudly against the gravel road common in suburban Georgia. My heart ached deeply as I watched that familiar front door slam shut behind me. Right then, my phone rang. The screen showed a local Georgia number, a 404 Atlanta area code. I almost didn't answer. Deep grief makes you suspicious of everything, even a standard iPhone ringtone. Mrs. George Kirkland. A man's voice came through the line. Professional, formal, with a touch of polite Southern charm. My name is Theodore Ellery. I'm an attorney practicing here in Atlanta. I'm calling on behalf of a client regarding the estate trust of a Mr. Winston. I hit the brakes, letting the engine idle by the side of the road. I think you have the wrong number. George. I don't believe I do, ma'am, he said calmly. This concerns your son. My hands turned ice cold before my brain could even process his words. My son's name is Luther. I don't know anyone named Winston. There was a brief pause on the line. It wasn't a pause of confusion, but rather a moment of careful calculation. Mrs. George Kirkland, I would much prefer to explain this in person rather than over a phone call. This isn't something I can easily summarize through a receiver. Are you able to come down to Atlanta soon? Today, if possible? Today? My voice trembled. Why would I drive all that way today for a man I've never even heard of? George. Because, he said, slowing his cadence, choosing each word with extreme care. You need to hear this directly from me, and you need to come right now. Silence fell over the line as he waited for my reply. There was something strange in his tone, not the panic of an emergency room call, but an urgent seriousness, as if he absolutely did not want to repeat the truth twice. George. That tone made my stomach knot up instantly. I dug a CVS receipt out of my purse, the only paper I had on hand, and scribbled down the address he gave me with a shaking hand. My handwriting was so messy I could barely read it myself. I didn't understand why a stranger talking about another stranger on the phone made my chest ache as if we were talking about my own flesh and blood. George. The address led to a massive glass and steel skyscraper on Peachtree Street in downtown Atlanta. It was larger and colder than any building I'd ever stepped into. I sat in my car, in the parking garage, for a full 6 minutes, just convincing my legs they could support my weight. I hadn't slept at all the night before. I had pushed through a 2-hour drive down Interstate 20, fueled entirely by heartbreak and half a sleeve of saltine crackers. The lawyer's words kept looping in my mind. "You need to come right now." It felt like a riddle I couldn't stop solving. The receptionist on the 14th floor didn't even look up. She simply pointed down the hall with a perfectly manicured hand. "Mr. Ellery is expecting you." When I walked into the office, Theodore Ellery stood up. He was a tall white gentleman with graying hair at his temples, wearing a flawless tailored suit. He shook my hand with absolute restraint, as if he knew I was fragile enough to shatter if he said the wrong word. His office smelled of old legal files and stale black coffee. "Mrs. Kirkland, thank you for coming on such short notice." "You didn't exactly leave me much of a choice," I replied, pulling out a chair and sitting down before he could even ask. He sat across from me, resting his hands over a closed manila folder. "I know this must be incredibly confusing for you. I will do my best to walk you through everything carefully." "Then let's start with who this Winston person is," I interrupted bluntly. "Because I buried my son 3 weeks ago, and I don't have the mental space for a stranger right now." A flicker of emotion crossed his face. It wasn't surprise. It looked more like a professional figuring out how to deliver a massive shock as gently as possible. "I represent an estate trust. My client used the name Winston for all of his business dealings. That is the name on every account, every filing, and every record I've handled for him over the last 18 years. 18 years, I repeated slowly, weighing the number. My son was 44 when he passed. Are you telling me this man was your client since Luther was 26? I'm saying the timeline aligns, Ellery stated precisely, neither confirming nor denying, a classic lawyer habit. "Say the name," I said through gritted teeth. "Say it clearly. Are you trying to tell me my son and this Winston are the exact same person?" He didn't answer right away. That silence spoke louder than any words ever could. "Mrs. Kirkland, the trust documents include strict written instructions on how and in what order to notify beneficiaries. I am not trying to make things difficult for you. This is a legal fiduciary duty, just like the attorney-client privilege I maintained while he was alive. That obligation doesn't end just because he passed away. Even now, I intend to follow it strictly. I'm not trying to torture you. I just want to ensure everything is handled exactly the way he requested." "Requested by who?" "By my client, he said, looking at me. "Done in writing, notarized alongside the trust papers before his passing." My hands started shaking again, just like they did in the car. "You keep calling him your client, as if that makes it easier than saying my son's name." "Right now, it probably is," he admitted. For the first time, his professional mask slipped, showing that even he felt how harsh this legal distance truly was. "I drove 2 hours on an empty stomach just to sit in this chair," my voice raised uncontrollably. "You called me, you said I had to come right now. So whatever you were told to hide, I think it's time to lay it on the table." Ellery looked at me for a long moment as if measuring my strength. Then, he reached out, picked up the folder that had remained closed since I walked in, and slid it across the smooth desk toward me. On the folder's label, printed clearly in bold black letters, was a name. It wasn't Luther. It was a name I had never heard my son use in all of his 44 years. I stared down at the name until the letters blurred together. Winston. When Ellery finally spoke again, I still hadn't touched the folder. "Before you open that," he said, "I need you to understand what you're about to look at. Otherwise, none of this will make sense." "Nothing about today makes sense," I replied coldly, "but give it a try." He opened a drawer and pulled out a second folder. This one was much thicker, spiral-bound, and looked like an accountant's ledger rather than a legal brief. He placed it right next to the first one but left it closed. 18 years ago, a business was established, a storage and logistics operations center near College Park. They handled freight warehousing, shipping contracts, and regional distribution. It remains highly operational and highly profitable to this day. A logistics warehouse, I repeated mechanically, as if saying it twice would make it sound less absurd. A very successful warehouse, Ellery corrected. From its very inception, the structure was set up so that the business existed solely to fund an irrevocable trust. I don't know what that means. It means that the moment those trust papers were signed, your son gave up personal ownership of everything inside it. Legally, from that day forward, it belonged to the trust, not to him. And under Georgia trust law, an irrevocable trust never has to be filed with any court or recorded in any public registry, unlike a traditional will or a property deed. He paused, watching my reaction. This is the core of the entire situation. It wasn't hidden through fraudulent means. The law itself was structured from day one so that it wouldn't be visible. Anyone looking into the personal assets of Luther Kirkland would only find the modest property he held publicly. Nothing would ever point to this. Not because he hid his tracks, but because the law didn't require tracks to be left. This time I reached out and flipped open the spiral-bound ledger. Long columns of figures and balance sheets stretched across page after page, dates, deposit amounts, contract renewals going back year after year. Saturdays, I murmured, speaking more to myself than to him. Sir, for nearly 20 years my son drove down to Atlanta every single Saturday. I used to ask him what kept him coming down here on the weekends, and he always said it was just work, that he was picking up extra shifts. I believed him because he never gave me a single reason not to. My fingers stopped on a specific date, a deposit, a massive number. It was an amount no blue-collar worker picking up extra shifts could ever earn. This wasn't extra shifts at all. No, ma'am, it certainly wasn't. The tension that had been building in my chest since the funeral finally broke in total silence. It wasn't a loud burst of tears, but a heavy, emptying realization. My son had spent 2 decades building a successful enterprise. Yet he let me believe the exhaustion in his voice during our Sunday phone calls was just from hard labor. He was quietly running a completely separate life 60 miles away from home. Why? My voice cracked completely. Why would he keep all this from his own mother? Ellery didn't rush to answer. When he spoke, his voice was remarkably soft. I think once I show you the rest, you'll understand a bit more. Some things can be explained by a ledger, but others can't. There is more to this than just financial accounts. I pointed toward the thick folder. There's more? One final thing, he said, standing up slowly and buttoning his suit jacket, as if the moment required formal respect. But it isn't a document. I looked up at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. What is it? Instead of answering immediately, he walked over to a filing cabinet against the wall. The slight hesitation in his hand, as he reached for the drawer handle, gave me a strong premonition. Whatever he was about to hand me was going to cut much deeper than cold numbers on a page. Ellery pulled out a piece of paper, kept it face down, and walked back to the desk. I want to prepare you, he said. But I don't think there's any proper way to do that, so I'm just going to show you. He flipped the paper over and slid it in front of me. It was a photograph printed on standard photo paper, the edges slightly faded, clearly handled many times before being placed in that drawer. In the picture, a man stood in front of a loading dock, one hand resting on a stack of wooden pallets, the other shielding his eyes from the sun. On the warehouse wall behind him, a massive sign read, Winston Logistics. The man was my son. It wasn't a look-alike or a distant relative. It was Luther, wearing a company polo shirt I had never seen before, standing in a world I never knew existed, looking more relaxed and at peace than I had seen him in years. I couldn't say a single word. My hand instinctively went to my mouth. I just sat there, my fingertips trembling against the edges of the photo, staring at my son. a man who possessed an entire life I had never caught a single glimpse of. Ellery didn't break the silence. He didn't explain the photo, he didn't rush me, and he didn't offer empty pleasantries. He just sat across from me and let me process it. Torch. It felt like standing beside someone at a gravesite, letting them stay until they were ready to step away. I don't know how long I sat like that. When I finally looked up, the hands on the wall clock behind him had moved much further than I realized. "That's him," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It really is him." "Yes, ma'am. He looks happy." It felt strange to say, almost like an accusation, as if happiness was something he owed me an explanation for. I hadn't seen him look like since he was a little boy. Ellery stayed quiet, letting the statement hang in the room because there really were no words to follow it. I carefully set the photograph down, handling it like fragile glass, and pressed my palms flat against the desk to steady myself. The shock was turning into a heavy sorrow. Not just for losing him, but for the man I never truly got the chance to know while he was alive. "Why?" I asked again, clearing my throat. "Why did he hide this from everyone? Even from me?" Ellery paused, choosing his words like someone testing thin ice. "He didn't hide it from everyone," he finally said. "He only hid it from the people who would have taken it all away." Those words hit me like a cold wave. "Taken away," I repeated. "By who?" Ellery's eyes flicked briefly toward the closed folder between us before returning to my face. Calm, patient, and professional. "That is a much longer story," he said. "But I don't think you need me to spell out exactly who he was protecting it from. I think a part of you already knows the answer." Sitting there, my mind flashed back to 11 days ago. Denise standing coldly in the bedroom doorway, Sylvia watching me like a hawk, and a reality I hadn't wanted to connect until this very moment. A part of you already knows Ellery was right. But knowing something deep down and hearing it out loud are two completely different kinds of pain. I wasn't ready to dive into that second pain just yet. "Then tell me the rest," I said firmly. "All of it. I hadn't driven all this way just to go home with half the truth." Ellery nodded slowly, reached into the same cabinet, and pulled out a thin binder. It was completely different from the thick ledger. He laid it down and opened it himself. "The revenue generated from this business went far beyond your son's personal needs," he explained. "Most men in that position would choose to expand, reinvest, or grow the operation. But Luther did something else." I looked at the pages inside the binder. There were dozens of names, organized by year with dollar amounts listed next to phrases like tuition fees and trade placement. "What is this? A foundation?" "It doesn't have a formal name, but it has been running for over a decade," Ellery said. "It provides scholarships and vocational job placements specifically for young men aging out of the foster care system around the East Point area. 12 to 15 young men every single year. No press releases, no public awards, and no board of directors, using it for clout." My finger traced down the list. Dozens of names I didn't recognize. Every single one represented a life my son had quietly stepped in to support, and he had never muttered a single word about it to anyone, not even to me. "He never mentioned it," I whispered. "Not a single word." "He wasn't the type to seek credit," Ellery said. "I've handled the disbursements for years, and he never once asked what people were saying about it." The only question he ever asked me was, "Did the funds get where they needed to go?" "And now that he's gone," I said slowly, "who asks that question? You?" "No, ma'am, that isn't my job, and it never was supposed to be." Ellery flipped toward the back of the binder and pulled out a single, thin document. It was the trust agreement itself, with one page already marked with a sticky note. The trust names a successor trustee, the individual who holds the legal power to manage the assets and direct its goals if the original trustee is unable to fulfill their duties. This designation is different from being a beneficiary. It carries actual control, the power to sign, the authority to direct funds, and the responsibility to keep the daily operations running. He turned the page toward me. There, right under a formal heading, my own name was clearly printed, Kesha Kirkland. He chose you. It's not an honorary title. It's a job with full legal authority. The weight in my chest grew heavier, but this time, it wasn't just shock. It was a profound, heartbreaking pride. I didn't even know how to hold that pride alongside my grief. Ellery reached into a pocket at the back of the binder and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was handwritten. The paper was soft along the creases, clearly opened and closed many times. He left this with very specific instructions, the lawyer said. For you, only for you. My hands shook as I took it. I unfolded it slowly. It was my son's handwriting. That familiar right-leaning print he'd had since elementary school. It looked right back at me, as if his voice could reach through the paper and hold my hand. They can take everything else. But not this. Keep it running, Ma. I read it 3 times before the words finally settled into a source of strength I could carry, rather than a blow that would break me. He wanted me to do this, I said to myself, not really asking Ellery. He built all of this, keeping it safe from anyone who would have torn it apart and sold it off, and then he left it to me. Not just the resources, but the responsibility, the right to protect it. According to the legal documents, yes, Ellery said softly. I folded the paper back along its worn creases and pressed it firmly into my palm. I felt a shift inside me. Something drove me forward that grief alone never could. Right now, today, this year, I looked up at him. How many people are counting on this? How many young men are waiting on support that could suddenly stop because of his passing? Ellery's expression didn't change, but his quiet demeanor told me the number wasn't small, and the clock hadn't stopped just because Luther's heart did. By the time I drove back to Birmingham, that note was tucked safely inside my coat pocket like a living, breathing thing. When my car pulled up in front of the extended stay motel where I had been staying, I was no longer the same woman who had left it. Before leaving Atlanta, Ellery had given me one final piece of advice in a very deliberate, steady tone. Whatever you decide to say to Denise or Sylvia, please understand. If this turns into a legal dispute, every single word you tell them now could resurface and be twisted in court in ways you cannot control. Silence isn't running away. For now, silence is your absolute best defense. I didn't fully understand the weight of those words until I stood on Denise's porch once again. I hadn't even gone back to the motel first. I drove straight to her house. She opened the door, her brow already furrowed as if my presence alone was an unexpected bill she hadn't budgeted for. Kesha, we already talked about the house. We did, I said calmly. I'm not here to argue with you about the house. Sylvia appeared behind her almost instantly, arms crossed, looking like a sentry who had been keeping watch from the window. Then what are you doing here? I just wanted to let you both know that I made it down to Atlanta and back safely, I said deliberately, keeping my voice even. Since neither of you bothered to ask. Denise's eyes flickered ever so slightly. Atlanta? For what? Sylvia demanded. Personal business, I replied simply, watching her face closely, waiting for the crack I knew would appear. And it did, a tiny, momentary tightening of the muscles around her mouth, and a split-second, anxious glance over at Sylvia. What kind of personal business could you possibly have in Atlanta? Sylvia asked, her voice dropping low. Too low. It carried the sharp edge of a blade wrapped in silk. My son's business, I said, looking right at her. It turns out there were a lot of things about him that neither side of this family knew. I watched the statement land heavily between them. Denise dropped her arms slightly, as if the words had physically pushed her back. What are you talking about? I'm not here to give explanations to either of you today, I said, keeping Ellery's warning firmly in mind. Every single word I choose to speak right now is spoken with the understanding that one day it could be read aloud in a room with a court reporter sitting in the corner. I just want you to know that I am no longer the woman you put out on the street 11 days ago. The situation has changed. Kesha, if something is going on, you need to tell us, Denise said. This time, the unease in her voice was genuine, completely replacing her rehearsed calm. I don't need to tell you anything, I replied. I didn't need to 11 days ago either. Remember, you two made the rules very clear. Sylvia's jaw tightened. Porch. Don't come over here playing mind games with my daughter. I'm not playing games, I said. I'm just letting you know that I am not disappearing quietly. Whatever you thought the reality was, it is much bigger than you imagine. Denise's gaze quickly darted toward the doorframe, as if searching for physical support. Bigger? Are you talking about money? Kesha, if this is about money... Porch. It's not about money, I cut her off. At least, not the way you're thinking. Then what is it? Sylvia snapped, the silk completely gone from her voice. I stared at her for a long time, long enough that she shifted her weight uncomfortably. For the first time, she was the one unnerved by the silence, instead of being the one controlling it. That isn't an answer I owe you today. Porch. Before they could press any further, I turned around and walked away. As I reached the middle of the sidewalk, I heard Sylvia's lowered voice behind the half-closed door, speaking strictly to Denise. She isn't bluffing, Sylvia said. You saw her face. We need to find out exactly what cards that old woman is holding. I didn't stop walking. I didn't look back. Porch. But during the entire 20-minute drive back to the motel, my pulse was thumping loudly in my ears. 3 days passed, not a single sound from Denise's end, and as I was beginning to learn, silence is often much louder than a ringing phone. Porch. I stayed in the motel room, sorting through the few meager papers Luther had left behind that I managed to grab from my old bedroom boxes before being forced out. A few medical insurance policies, an expired passport. Nothing that hinted at Winston or Atlanta. I hadn't expected to find clues anyway. Clearly, his entire intention from the start was to ensure there was no trail to follow. Porch. On the 4th day, my phone buzzed with a voicemail left without the phone even ringing. A woman's voice, sharp, commanding, and extremely professional. Mrs. Kirkland, this is Farah calling from the law office of Reginald Voss. We are contacting you regarding the estate of your late son, Mr. Luther Kirkland. Please give us a call back at your earliest convenience. Porch. I sat there listening to the message twice before the reality of what I was hearing fully sank in. I hadn't hired a lawyer. Ellery was already representing the estate trust, or at least the part of it I now understood. So who exactly was Reginald Voss? And who had called him? I didn't call the number back. Instead, I dialed Ellery's office. Porch. His assistant told me he was currently in court and would return my call by early evening. That left me sitting alone with the voicemail and a terrible feeling I couldn't shake off. It felt like something heavy pressing against my ribs, refusing to leave no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. Porch. I remembered Sylvia's voice behind that half-closed door. We need to find out exactly what cards that old woman is holding. It hit me. This lawyer, Voss, wasn't calling on my behalf, he was calling for someone else. Later that evening, my phone rang again, and this time it was Ellery himself. Mrs. Porch. Kirkland, I wanted to reach out and give you a heads up before you heard it from another source, he said. My office received a call today from an attorney named Reginald Voss. He was asking general questions about the estate, timelines, structure, and whether there were any other claimants. He called me too, I said. Left a voicemail. I didn't answer. Good, Ellery said. Porch. I strongly advise that you don't, not without me on the line. Calls of this nature usually mean someone is testing the waters before taking formal legal action. Formal legal action? Like what? Like a formal challenge to the estate, he said. His tone was incredibly measured and careful, the exact same tone he used when he first slid that folder across the desk. Porch. I can't confirm who hired him or what their exact motivation is yet, but someone is digging around, which tells us they believe there is something to be contested or overturned. My stomach turned slowly. Denise, I said. Or her mother. Porch. I can't verify that, Ellery replied, but given the timing, combined with the conversation you described at their house, I'd be lying if I told you that wasn't the most likely explanation. Orch. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, phone pressed tight to my ear, my mind filled with images of Sylvia's tight jaw, Denise's shifting eyes, and the two of them plotting behind the door where I had already overheard half their secrets. So what do I do? I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. Nothing for now, Ellery said. Let them make the first move. Orch. But I want you to be mentally prepared, because if this escalates, it won't stay quiet for long. I thanked him, hung up, and sat holding the warm phone in my hand for a long time. Farah's message was still sitting in my inbox. A cold chill ran down my spine. Whatever Sylvia was planning over there, she was moving much faster than I had anticipated. Orch. 2 days later, Ellery invited me back to his office. No long explanation, just a simple request. There are a few matters that require your presence. I drove back south. With the shadow of Voss hanging over everything, my nerves were completely shot. When I walked into the 14th floor waiting area, there was only one other person there. A teenage boy, maybe 16 or 17 years old. Orch. He sat stiffly in the chair closest to the window, clutching a worn folder tightly against his lap, as if terrified someone might snatch it away. He looked up when I entered, gave me a quick, sharp glance, and then looked right back down at his folder. I sat down across from him, my mind still racing with thoughts of Sylvia and Voss, paying very little attention to the boy in the room. Orch. Everything cracked open when the receptionist called both of our names at the exact same time. You two, she said, pointing a finger toward the very end of the hallway. Mr. Ellery is ready for both of you to come in together. The boy and I exchanged a look of pure confusion. I followed right behind his heavy footsteps as we walked back into Ellery's office. Orch. But the moment we crossed that threshold, I knew from the look on the lawyer's face that he didn't just know this boy. This was absolutely not an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Kirkland, Ellery said softly, adjusting his glasses. This is Elias. He used the boy's first name with a familiarity that had zero professional distance. He knew him. Orch. In fact, Ellery's shoulders dropped just a fraction, looking like a man who had been braced for a blow for a long time and finally felt the ground stop shaking. I don't understand why we are both sitting here, I said, my voice tight. Ellery motioned for us to take our seats. As Elias sat down, his knees started shaking uncontrollably. His hands still gripped that beat-up folder like a lifeline. Orch. My funding stopped. Elias blurted out before Ellery could even open his mouth. His voice was defensive, raw, and completely on edge. Every single month for years, money was deposited for my school and expenses. Then, out of nowhere, it just vanished. I dug through my mom's old files and found this. He pulled out a faded bank wire confirmation slip and laid it on the desk. Orch. The name on it says Winston. I called the bank, but they wouldn't tell me a single thing. They just said this law firm's name was listed in the internal notes. So, I came here. I know, Ellery said calmly. Elias froze instantly. You know? You know who I am? I've known your name since you were 7 years old, son, Ellery said. Orch. I've been managing your support payments ever since your mother initially agreed to the arrangement. But my strict instructions were to never contact you directly, and to never explain anything unless you came through that door yourself. I gave my word, and I kept it, even when it wasn't easy. The entire room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Orch. So you just knew this whole time? Elias's voice cracked, vibrating between anger and utter disbelief. You could have told me anything, but you just waited? I was legally bound by your father's final wishes, Ellery said, his voice completely steady. But that didn't mean I was comfortable with the silence. My father! Elias spat the words out like they belonged to a stranger. Where is he? Orch. Why isn't he standing here telling me this himself? Ellery grew even quieter. It was that same deep, controlled stillness he had shown when he pushed the Winston folder toward me days ago. Elias, I am so sorry. There is no easy way to say this. His name was Luther. He passed away a few weeks ago. Orch. The color drained from Elias's face, leaving him completely pale before a flush of heat rushed right back into his cheeks. His jaw trembled as he tried to piece together a sentence, but nothing came out. I never even got to meet him. Nobody told me anything. And now, I'll never even get the chance. Orch. He snapped his head toward me, his eyes bloodshot and wide, staring at my face as if trying to find where I fit into this sudden wreckage. Who are you? Before my throat could produce a sound, Ellery answered for me. She is your grandmother. For a full minute after those words left Ellery's mouth, nobody in that room moved a muscle. Orch. Grandmother? Elias repeated, chewing on the word like a jagged stone. I don't have a grandmother. I don't have any family. Since my mom passed, it's just been me. Since my son passed, most days it's just been me too, I said softly. He looked at me for a long time. The mask of suspicion didn't drop. Instead, it settled even deeper into his eyes. How do I know this isn't some kind of setup? Orch. Whenever money is involved, people just start appearing out of nowhere. I've seen it happen at school with kids who lost their parents. Suddenly, they're surrounded by people claiming to be long-lost relatives. Everyone wants a piece of what's left. I completely understand why you think that, I said, keeping my voice as level as possible. Orch. I didn't reach out to touch him, and I didn't demand that he trust me. Because until an hour ago when you walked into this office, I didn't know you existed either. I have no claim over anything that belongs to you, and you don't owe me a single ounce of trust, just because a lawyer said a word out loud. Orch. Ellery made a quick excuse, muttering something about needing to retrieve some files, and stepped out of the office, leaving the two of us alone in the quiet room. How old are you? I asked. 17, he said, looking down at his folder, refusing to meet my eyes. My mom never mentioned his name. Not once. Orch. She just told me the money would arrive on time, and not to ask questions about where it came from. It was like a rule I was never allowed to break. She was protecting you, I said. Probably more than either of us can understand right now. Protecting me from what? A father who never showed his face? His voice cracked hard on the word, father. I used to think he didn't even know I existed. Orch. Now I find out he had enough resources to run an entire corporation, but he still couldn't bother to come see me once. I only found out about this business 3 days ago myself, I told him. I knew absolutely nothing about any of this. He kept it from me too. That seemed to register somewhere deep inside him, but his guard remained fully up. How convenient. You show up knowing nothing. Orch. I show up knowing nothing. And now we're just supposed to magically be family. I am not asking you to call me anything, I said. I'm not asking you to trust me today or even this week. I am just giving you the facts of where we stand. You can take all the time you need to decide what those facts are worth to you. He stared at me, searching my face for a lie. Orch. When he didn't find one, his shoulders finally dropped a fraction of an inch. It wasn't trust, but the immediate threat of danger seemed to leave the room. We sat there like that for a long time. Two strangers who had never met until an hour ago, completely bound together by a man neither of us fully understood. I wasn't ready to talk about what came next. Everything was moving too fast. Orch. To make a massive decision like this on the exact same day that grief was tearing me apart felt completely surreal. When Ellery walked back in, he found us sitting in a much calmer silence than before. I need a few days, I told him, before we decide how Elias fits into all of this. Ellery's expression remained unchanged. I completely understand that you need time, Mrs. Kirkland. Truly, I do. Orch. But I have to be entirely honest with you. He paused, his voice turning heavy as lead. I'm not sure we have a few days anymore. Right then, the front desk receptionist knocked on the door, holding a thick manila envelope sealed with a bright red overnight rush sticker. Printed clearly across the front was my full name. It was a local courier delivery. My palms felt damp as I took it from her. Orch. I tore open the seal and pulled out the legal documents inside. Just reading the first few bold lines at the top made my breath catch completely. Fulton County Superior Court. Plaintiff, Denise Kirkland, action. Petition to revoke trust. Based on undue influence they were suing. Sylvia had found her angle. Torch. They were claiming that Luther was manipulated and brainwashed by an unnamed associate when he set up the trust, and they were asking the court to completely dissolve the entire irrevocable structure. I looked up sharply at Ellery. Torch. If a judge reviews this and moves it forward, Ellery said, his voice completely devoid of comfort, every layer of privacy protecting this trust will be stripped away. Once we enter the discovery process, every single line item, every record. His gaze slowly shifted toward Elias, who was sitting right next to me. Torch. Ilya's existence, his identity, and every single cent the trust has provided for him will become a matter of public court record. They aren't just trying to seize the business, they will completely dismantle this boy's peace and stability. The folder in Elias's hand slipped and hit the floor. He looked at me in total shock, like a deer backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. Torch. I gripped the legal complaint in my hands, the sharp edges of the paper digging into my fingers. In that exact moment, my sorrow was completely burned away by a fierce, protective anger. My son had built a fortress in the dark to keep this boy safe, and now a pack of greedy wolves was trying to tear the fortress down and destroy the boy with it. Torch. I looked at Elias, then turned my eyes back to Ellery. My voice came out incredibly calm, but it carried an icy resolve I had never felt in all my 68 years. Let them try. The handmade quilt I had spent months stitching hit the bottom of the trash can before I even had a chance to set my evening bag down. Torch. I just stood there, watching my future daughter-in-law toss it away with a flick of her wrist, treating it like a piece of spoiled garbage. Above us, the massive crystal chandelier reflected off the expensive diamond bracelet on her wrist, catching the light in a way that made my eyes sting. I am 63 years old. Torch. I've spent my entire life right here in Birmingham, Alabama, the heart of the South. 3 years ago, I buried the husband who had shared the biggest part of my journey. For decades, I truly believed I had raised a son who knew how to read people, a son who would never choose a woman like this. But right now, reality was delivering a harsh lesson. Torch. We were at the city's top country club for the wedding rehearsal dinner. The room was loud, filled with the constant chatter of guests. Men and women were raising champagne flutes, glasses clinking continuously, while a DJ tested the heavy bass on the sound system in the corner. Torch. In a room completely consumed by the shallow vanity of old money and new wealth, it seemed like absolutely nobody cared about what had just happened except for me. Sabrina turned around and picked up her glass of Moet, wearing that effortless, detached arrogance common among Ivy League graduates. Torch. She acted as though she hadn't just thrown away 6 months of my hard work. Hours spent under a desk lamp late at night, stitching until my hands cramped and my eyes were completely bloodshot and dry. In our circle, we only use high-end luxury labels, she told her cousin standing next to her. She didn't even look at me when she said it. Torch. She just laughed freely, completely ignoring the fact that I was standing less than 3 feet away, still holding the gift bag that Quilt had just come out of. To her, I was just a ghost in the room, an unimportant, lower-class observer. Before I go any further, I want to tell you something. No matter when you are listening to this story, please have patience. Torch. Right now, I am sitting at the kitchen table in my old house. The clock on the wall is nearing midnight, and I've been sitting on this hard wooden chair for over an hour without moving a single muscle. Back to that moment at the dinner. I didn't say a word to her. Not a single syllable. I was wearing the finest silk evening gown from my closet. Torch. In front of the entire room, a space filled with the most influential figures attending this $1 million wedding. I took slow, steady steps right toward that gilded trash can. I bent down, reached inside with both hands, and lifted my quilt out. I didn't yank it roughly, and I didn't drop a single tear. Standing right there in front of the guests who had turned to watch, I folded it carefully. Torch. My movements were gentle and deliberate, as if I were folding a living, breathing thing. Then, holding it tight against my chest, I walked all the way back to my seat under the gaze of everyone in the room. My son, Emmett, didn't even look over. He was standing on the far side of the hall, completely locked in a conversation about golf or the stock market with his groomsmen. He had absolutely no idea that the woman he was about to vow his life to had just done something incredibly cruel, something I would never forget as long as I had breath left in my body. I said my goodbyes early. I kept a polite smile on my face for a few relatives, telling them I was getting older, felt tired, and needed to head home to rest. When I turned to leave, Sabrina still didn't glance my way. She was far too busy. She was completely occupied accepting fake compliments from her bridesmaids about her stunning dress, her Christian Louboutin heels, and her supposedly impeccable taste. I drove home in silence. The quilt sat quietly in the passenger seat next to me like a silent companion, a family member who had been deeply wronged but refused to complain. I didn't turn on the radio, and I didn't call a soul. I just drove through the empty streets of Birmingham. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my thoughts drifted back down into a dark place I had forced myself to avoid for the last 3 years. When I walked into the house, I spread the quilt flat across the oak kitchen table. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I was truly examining it, my fingers tracing the tight, neat rows of stitches, like I was checking the mechanism of a lock, even if I didn't want to admit to myself what I was actually looking for. Sabrina had absolutely no clue what she almost threw away tonight. She didn't know. And Emmett didn't know either. I pulled out the chair across the table and sat down. For the first time in 3 whole years, my hands weren't steady. They shook slightly in the dim light. At 11:40 p.m., my phone screen lit up. Before I even picked it up, I knew exactly who it was. Ma. Emmett's voice sounded thin, like a string pulled so tight it was right on the verge of snapping. Sabrina told me what happened at the dinner. I leaned back slowly against the chair, keeping my eyes fixed on the quilt spread across the table. Oh, did she? What did she say? She said you got really quiet afterward. She said you went right up to the trash can yourself and took the thing back. He paused, his heavy breathing coming through the receiver. She said the way you held onto it when you picked it up. It looked strange. In the background of the call, I could faintly hear Sabrina's voice. She was somewhere in their living room, still letting out that careless laugh, still talking about that cheap wool scrap. She was treating the whole thing like a hilarious highlight of her perfect evening, a joke to show how much better she was. She had absolutely no idea what kind of edge she had just handed my son. How was it strange? I asked. My tone was as calm as if we were discussing tomorrow's weather forecast. Emmett seemed to catch his breath on the other end. Ma, you never lose your composure over little things. His voice carried a deep confusion and a hint of quiet panic. When Dad's company hit that massive crisis and the bank repossessed his truck right out of the driveway, you didn't break. A quilt. What makes this any different? I didn't answer him right away. I let a heavy silence stretch out between us. Because some things, no matter how badly someone wants to know them, cannot just be handed over during a midnight phone call. That is a rule of the South and a boundary this family holds onto tightly. Ma! His voice finally broke, cracking down the middle. What exactly is stitched inside that quilt? That was the exact question I had spent 3 years waiting to hear, yet deeply feared hearing at the same time. I let out a short laugh. Not because anything in this world was funny, but because in that moment, my body couldn't find any other sound that matched the sheer absurdity and weight of the situation. You'll never know, son, I told him over the line, because in your circle you only use high-end luxury labels. The other end of the line fell completely dead. Total silence. When you hear that kind of stillness, you know the person on the other end is processing a massive shock. He was analyzing that sentence over and over in his head, trying to figure out if he had just been insulted by his own mother, or if he had just been handed a secret that would completely alter his entire reality. "That's not funny, Ma," he finally managed to squeeze out after a long pause. "I wasn't trying to make you laugh, baby. Good night." Orch. Before he could ask another question, I hung up the phone. I knew my son too well. I knew that once he caught a loose thread, he would pull on it relentlessly until the entire structure fell apart in his hands, exposing the raw truth underneath. After disconnecting, I placed the phone face down on the table. I sat there, my heart pounding far harder than I cared to admit. Orch. Even at 63, I could read every single frequency in my son's voice. And I knew that tone meant he was absolutely not going to let this rest. On his end of the line, I could visualize exactly what happened next. The room probably felt much colder than Emmett expected. Even though I wasn't in the living room of that high-end apartment, I knew my son. Orch. I knew what happened the second he set that warm phone down. Sabrina was undoubtedly still lounging on that expensive, imported Italian sofa, still carrying that mocking smile. She was likely continuing her rant, saying she couldn't believe an adult woman would cling to a ragged old blanket like it was a priceless heirloom, calling it cheap and a fire hazard. Orch. And Emmett, my son, the true gentleman who had never raised his voice at her once during their entire relationship, stood there with the phone cooling in his hand, and slowly turned around. He looked at her with a completely different gaze. Orch. It was the kind of look you give someone when you suddenly remove a pair of tinted glasses you've worn for a long time, seeing their true face clearly, for the very first time. She was still laughing. She had absolutely no realization that the firm ground she thought she was standing on had already begun to give way. Emmett repeated this part of the story to me later, word for word. Orch. I've replayed the scene so many times in my head that it feels like I was standing right there in the corner of their living room watching it unfold. At the time, Sabrina just wouldn't let the quilt issue go. She kept insisting Emmett was overreacting, calling it just a blanket. She even used that superior tone of voice to tell him to stop being so sensitive about poor people's insecurities. Orch. Poor people. That phrase acted like a hammer, completely shattering a barrier Emmett had forced himself to keep locked inside his mind. Poor people's insecurities? Emmett asked. His voice was flat, entirely devoid of emotion, which made it terrifying. Like last Thanksgiving, when you sat at the table and told my mother her southern greens were too greasy for your refined palate. Orch. Or when you walked into the house she's lived in for 30 years and called it quaint for a starter home. Sabrina froze, completely caught off guard. That's different, she argued. Is it? How is it different? Emmett pressed forward, refusing to give her an inch of ground. Because I've let you make comments like that for an entire year. Orch. On our anniversary, when she made us that handmade gift, I remember the exact look on your face. You called it quaint. Quaint, Sabrina. You said it with the same tone you'd use for a $2 piece of junk you found at a flea market. I was just being honest. I like minimalism and I don't like old clutter. Is there something wrong with that? Orch. That isn't honesty, that's cruelty, and you're just wrapping your malice in the word straightforward. Emmett told me that as he spoke those words, his chest felt incredibly tight and painful. It felt like carrying a massive sandbag for miles, to the point where your body accepts the pressure as normal. Orch. Only in that moment, when he finally released the weight, did he realize how heavy it truly was. He said he had to stop and take deep breaths because, once the first grievance came out, every other memory from the past year flooded his mind like a broken dam, moving too fast for him to even organize the words. Sabrina crossed her arms, shifting into a defensive posture. So what? Orch. Is this a full interrogation now? Just because I spoke the truth about a ragged quilt tonight? This isn't a small thing, and it was never just about one incident, Emmett said, looking right at her. Tonight was just the one time you couldn't pass your actions off as a joke. She didn't apologize. That was the moment Emmett completely checked out of the relationship. Orch. Not only did she refuse to apologize, but she turned incredibly defensive and angry. She accused Emmett of twisting her innocent comments, trying to invent a pattern of behavior that didn't exist. She even sharply claimed that Emmett was just projecting his mother's widow insecurities onto himself. Emmett told me that right then, everything inside him went completely still. Porch. It was an eerie kind of quiet. Anger usually brings shouting, but this stillness wasn't rage. It was a heavy, sinking sorrow, the kind that hits when you suddenly realize you've spent a whole year making endless excuses for someone who is fundamentally cold-hearted. My mother, he said, keeping his voice incredibly low, did not say a single harsh word to you tonight. Porch. She simply walked to a trash can, picked up a gift she spent 6 months making for you, and went home in silence. Sabrina, that isn't insecurity. That is dignity. That is a level of grace you couldn't understand even if it were explained to you. Sabrina's expression changed instantly, not softening into guilt but hardening into cold defense. Wow, she scoffed, her eyes wide with disbelief. Porch. So what's the plan? Are you saying you're calling off the wedding tomorrow, just because I don't like your mom's homemade blanket? Emmett said. He stood there for a long time before answering. He let himself feel the full weight of the question, because in a very hidden part of his heart, he still held a faint hope that she would see the severity of the situation, stop, and take back the cruelty. Porch. But she didn't. She just stood there proudly, like a judge rendering a verdict. Yes, I am calling off the wedding, Emmett said, every single word landing like a heavy strike, because I finally see exactly who you are. For the past year, I forced myself to ignore your arrogance because I wanted this to work so badly. But now, I'm awake. Porch. She let out a sharp laugh, convinced it was completely absurd. Emmett, have you lost your mind? There are hundreds of guests flying in from all over the country tomorrow morning. Members of the board, my dad's partners from the country club. Are you seriously trying to play this dramatic game the night before our wedding? I am completely serious. The wedding is off. Porch. Emmett told me that after he uttered those words, the luxurious room fell into a dead silence, unlike anything they had experienced in their entire relationship. It wasn't a pause to gather energy for the next insult. It was the quiet that comes with a final ending. She didn't start crying immediately. Porch. She just stood there with her arms crossed, watching him, entirely convinced that within a few minutes he would look down, apologize like he always did, and take the words back. But he didn't. He turned around and picked up his phone from the marble counter. In that exact moment, the very first call he wanted to make wasn't to his best man or his closest friends. It was to me. Porch. The next morning at 7:15 a.m., the manager of the city's top florist called, asking which area of the venue they should deliver the 200 white peonies that had been flown overnight from Holland. That was exactly how I discovered my son had actually followed through on his words from the night before. I hadn't even had a single sip of my morning coffee yet. Porch. I just stood there in the kitchen, receiver pressed to my ear, telling a complete stranger on the other end in an incredibly steady voice. The wedding is canceled. Yet beneath that calm delivery, I could feel my hands fighting to shake. By 9 a.m., the venue coordinator was calling me repeatedly. By 9:30 a.m., Sabrina's mother called my private landline directly. Porch. With every sentence, her high society voice rose an octave, hysterically demanding to know what awful thing my son had done to her daughter the night before. You'll have to ask Emmett that yourself, I told her calmly. I don't speak for my son. She absolutely despised that answer. Without even uttering a basic goodbye, she slammed the receiver down hard. Porch. Around 10 a.m., guests carrying luxury luggage began arriving at the downtown five-star hotel. What was supposed to be a celebratory arrival quickly turned into confused whispers, echoing through the lobby and urgent phone calls made from quiet corners. I went down to the hotel myself. Porch. Because at a time like this, someone needed to stand tall and look these people in the eye. rather than leaving my son alone to face a room full of out-of-town family and business executives who had flown in expecting vows, champagne, and an expensive cake. Emmett stood near the lobby entrance, his jaw clenched tight, barely uttering a word to anyone. Whenever someone approached trying to fish for information, he gave them the exact same cold response. The wedding is canceled. That is all. No explanations, no details, just a completely rigid expression that looked exactly like his late father's. I remembered clearly that when Richard wore that face during board meetings, executives who had spent decades in business wouldn't dare make a sound. I watched silently as relatives whispered behind their hands. I watched Sabrina's bridesmaids gather near the front desk, throwing accusatory looks our way as if we had committed a massive crime. I even heard a distant aunt I hadn't seen in 6 years lean over to another woman and whisper just loud for me to hear. I always thought that boy could have married into a much better family anyway. I didn't respond to a single piece of gossip. I had buried the man who shared my life. I had sat in much colder, harsher rooms and heard insults 100 times worse than this. This scene was nothing to me. I spent the entire morning handling the logistics Emmett couldn't touch right now. Canceling the expensive catering service, managing the frantic wedding planner who was panicked about deposits, and speaking with the hotel manager to ensure they wouldn't charge my son penalty fees for the luxury suites that would now sit empty tonight. Focusing on those tedious realistic tasks helped. It kept my hands busy, so my mind had no room to wander into darker thoughts. Close to noon, the crowd in the lobby finally began to thin out, and the suffocating tension in the air eased a bit. That was when David Fenwick walked over to me. He had been Richard's most trusted right-hand man at the firm, someone who worked under my husband for nearly 20 years. In all that time, the man had never said anything to me beyond standard, empty pleasantries about my health. But today, he was clearly not here for small talk. "Lois," he said, using my name. His tone was extremely cautious, like a man weighing each word carefully before letting it leave his mouth. I know today is not the ideal time to bring this up. But considering the current stability issues inside the firm since Richard's passing, I have to ask. Regarding his personal estate and the outstanding shares, when exactly can we expect a clear resolution? He paused, his eyes locked onto mine, searching my face for any sign of weakness. The board keeps asking. We need to know who holds ultimate control over the company right now. I stood my ground, looking at him in silence for a very long time. Long enough that he began to look uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Richard's affairs, I said, looking right into his eyes with absolute authority, will be handled completely when I decide the time is right. Not according to the board's timeline, but according to mine. Fenwick's mouth tightened instantly. I could tell he wanted to push harder, but judgment told him to keep his mouth shut. I didn't give him another thought. I turned my back on him and walked straight toward my son. I left the critical question hanging in the air, leaving him with a cold exit to wonder and worry on his own. I walked toward Emmett, keeping my spine perfectly straight, though only I knew how fast my heart was actually beating. Because the answer that would resolve every doubt the board had, the answer that would determine the fate of that entire business empire, was currently sitting quietly in the deepest corner of my hallway closet. It wasn't locked in a heavy bank vault, and it wasn't wrapped in complicated legal documents. It was hidden right inside the rows of stitching of the cotton quilt Sabrina had thrown into the trash. It was the third day after the wedding that never happened. My private legal firm sent out a routine notice requesting an update to the shareholder registry files due to Richard's passing. It was a standard legal procedure, and the document was copied to the senior executives at the company. When my attorney's assistant mentioned they had sent it out as required, I didn't think much of it, but I should have. That afternoon, David Fenwick called my landline. Hearing the sharp ring, My instinct was to leave it, but intuition told me I needed to pick up. Loa. His voice carried that careful, light tone men use when they are trying to fish for information. I received a notice from your legal firm today. An update to the shareholder registry. Is there a transfer of equity taking place that someone at my level should be aware of? It is a routine legal document, David. Nothing more, I replied coldly. Receiving routine documents from a top-tier law firm 3 days after a massive wedding is called off doesn't exactly fit the standard pattern, he said, letting the sentence hang there, waiting to see if I would fill the silence with a panicked explanation. I didn't. Instead, an image of the quilt sitting folded in my hallway closet flashed through my mind. It was completely ironic that on this third day, everyone was desperately testing the waters over pieces of paper printed with legal terms, while the real answer that could dictate all their fates, an answer not wrapped in complex legal language but carefully secured with cotton and thread, was sitting just a few feet away from where I stood. Lois, I gave 20 of the best years of my life to this company. Fenwick's tone dropped, carrying a clear edge of pressure. I believe that if there's a shift in the executive power structure, I've earned the right to know. When there is an announcement to make, you will know what you need to know. I stood my ground completely. As for now, I have nothing to say. He deeply disliked that answer. The heavy sigh he let out right before hanging up the phone completely exposed both his frustration and his ambition. I thought that was the end of the phone call, until later that evening, Emmett called. His voice carried a tight anxiety I hadn't heard since the day he called off the wedding. Fenwick had gone to see him at the office earlier that afternoon. Like a calculating vulture, he waited until the hallways of the executive suite were completely empty before walking into Emmett's office and standing right in front of his desk. "Your mother has been avoiding me all week," Fenwick had said, looking down his nose at my son. I received a legal notice regarding the shareholder files, and when I asked her directly, she refused to tell me a thing. "How much do you know about this?" Emmett told him he knew absolutely nothing, which was the honest truth. Yet, that truth seemed to irritate Fenwick more than a lie would have. Somebody in authority at this company needs to know what's going on. Fenwick pressed his palms flat onto the desk, leaning in and lowering his voice, putting on a hypocritical display of concern. "I'm not trying to make things difficult, Emmett. I am simply protecting what is mine, the legacy I spent 20 years building alongside your father. Right now, nobody is notifying me of leadership changes, and nobody is stepping up to speak. That is the real issue." Fenwick locked eyes with my son and delivered his final bit of poison. "Your mother is hiding something, and it affects all of our stakes. If I were you, I'd start asking myself just how deep this goes." Emmett told me he didn't answer right away. Sitting behind his desk, he felt a sharp chill spread through his chest. It had nothing to do with Sabrina or the cancelled wedding. This was a completely new fear, directed straight at me. "Ma," his voice was much quieter on the phone than I expected. "About Dad and about the company. Are you keeping something from me?" I closed my eyes before answering. I pictured the quilt again. He had no idea how close he was to the truth. "Emmett, baby, I need you to trust me just a little while longer." Silence stretched over the line for a very long time. "That's exactly what Fenwick said you'd say," he finally replied, his voice filled with a heartbreaking exhaustion. "He told me I shouldn't blindly trust you on this." The following Thursday, Emmett called again. From the very first word out of his mouth, I knew a boundary inside him had completely broken. "Ma, do you know what people at the office are saying behind my back? They're saying the only reason I'm a regional manager is because of my last name." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the exact spot where the quilt had been spread out. "Who said that to your face?" "Nobody has the nerve to say it to my face." Until today. His tone carried a sharp edge I rarely heard from him, less like anger and more like the cry of a wounded animal. I was in the break room. Two supervisors from logistics didn't know I was there. Porch. One of them said, "Of course, he's the regional manager. His old man's name is on the building." The other one laughed and said, "Must be nice to move straight to the top without ever having to clear out the competition." I closed my eyes tightly. "Emmett, I've worked my tail off here for 12 years, Ma." 12 years. His composure finally broke. Porch. When I started, I worked back-to-back night shifts. For 12 years, if a logistics issue came up at 2 in the morning, I didn't even have time to throw on clothes before picking up the phone to handle it. Every single title I have, I earned. His voice cracked with deep frustration on the word, earned. But now, because of these rumors, everyone is treating my hard work like a complete joke. Porch. Your work is not a joke, I said firmly, trying to steady him. It has always had value. Then why does it feel like the ground is splitting right under my feet? Everyone is questioning where this company is headed, and the only person who can answer won't tell me a single word. Porch. Before he even mentioned Fenwick's name, I could feel the man's shadow over the conversation, making my chest tighten. Fenwick has been feeding rumors to regional management all week, Emmett said, desperate. He's dropping hints everywhere that a massive shakeup is coming at the top, and that certain people are about to get special treatment. He didn't use my name, but he didn't have to. Porch. I sat there quietly as a sickening chill washed over me. The trust Richard spent 20 years building within the firm was being weaponized by Fenwick to plant doubt where it never belonged. Ma, you know I got here by working hard. Emmett's voice turned into a plea. So why are you the one making everyone question my ability? Porch. Those words weighed 100 times heavier than any threat Fenwick could ever make. Emmett, listen to me. My voice shook from the sheer effort of holding back. What is happening right now is not about whether you deserve your position. You built your own path. Nobody, including your father, handed you a single day of your career. Then what is happening, Ma? He nearly shouted. Porch. Because Fenwick is standing out there telling everyone you're hiding a secret that could break this company, and I'm standing in this building looking like a fool, unable to give anyone a defensive answer. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I need you to trust me just a little while longer. That's not an answer. I know it isn't, I said with difficulty. Porch. But it's all I can give you right now. The phone went completely dead. It was a different kind of silence than the night of the rehearsal dinner. This one was heavier, filled with frustration and a sharp, cold sense of betrayal. You're asking me to stand up for a company I might not even belong to, he said finally, his words cutting deep. And you won't even tell me why. Porch. I didn't have a response that could comfort him without breaking the solemn vow I made to my husband 3 years ago. So, I said nothing. I let the silence serve as his answer. During that long, grueling week, I had no idea what was happening behind closed doors within the Cordell family. But later, I pieced together the fragments. Porch. When I saw the full picture, I finally understood how Sabrina's proud, untouchable world had completely shattered before she ever stood on my porch again. According to what Emmett later heard from a cousin still in touch with her family, the first call came from Sabrina's mother. She didn't ask if Sabrina was heartbroken or if she was doing okay. Her only concern was presentation. Porch. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this makes our family look? Her mother screamed inside Sabrina's apartment, not even taking off her coat, acting as though she couldn't stand to be in a room that smelled of failure. Half the city received invitations. Porch. Now I have to call every single one of them back and explain why my daughter's engagement became a complete joke the night before the wedding. Sabrina tried to explain what Emmett had said. The year-long pattern of dismissive remarks, the patronizing comments, and the quilt. Her mother cut her off without a shred of patience. A quilt? Porch. Sabrina, are you telling me he called off $1 million wedding in front of our guests over a blanket? This isn't about a blanket. This is what happens when you kids grow up spoiled and don't know how to look at the big picture. choosing to obsess over trivial nonsense instead. Her mother grabbed her Hermes bag from the counter, already halfway out the door. Orch, I have a disastrous amount of public relations calls to make. Your father is frantic trying to figure out how to explain this mess to the Ashworths at the country club. We have to focus on damage control this weekend. Damage control. Not, are you okay, baby? Not, do you need your mother to stay tonight? Her father was even colder. Orch. When he called later that evening, his first words weren't about his daughter's broken heart, but a direct interrogation into whether any portion of the massive venue deposits could be recovered. He demanded to know if this would affect his standing with key business partners flying in for the event. Orch. According to what drifted back to me, after those 2 freezing phone calls, Sabrina sat entirely alone in her large, empty apartment, surrounded by unopened luxury wedding gifts. The family who claimed to love and protect her couldn't see past high society vanity to care for a real human being in deep pain. Orch. Weeks later, she confided in her cousin that it was the first time in her life she felt like a mere inconvenience to her family, a liability to their reputation. She was handled as a PR crisis to be managed, not a person going through a trauma, and during that long, silent, humiliating week, her mind kept looping back to the one moment at the rehearsal dinner she had dismissed. She thought of me. Orch. She remembered how I had walked deliberately to the trash can, reached in and pulled that quilt back into my arms as if it had a heartbeat. At the time, she couldn't comprehend it, mocking it as a dramatic, low-class scene. Orch. But sitting alone in the dark, experiencing what it felt like to be tossed aside like garbage by the people who were supposed to value her, the image that remained was me carefully protecting a dismissed item in front of everyone who thought it was worthless. She didn't call Emmett, and she didn't call me. Orch. She just sat in the dark, turning that image over in her mind, driven by a growing intuition that on the night she thought she was completely right, she had missed something incredibly important. I had no idea Sabrina was digging for answers until it was already done. Much later, she confessed exactly what she did. Orch. I believed every word because it aligned perfectly with the hidden currents of that week. She remembered a woman named Patrice from a company holiday party 2 years ago. Patrice was a soft-spoken woman who handled archives and intake for our family's private legal counsel. Orch. Sabrina had barely given her the time of day back then, but she remembered the name and that Patrice still did occasional contract work for Sylvester's firm. She found an old company directory Emmett had left behind before the split and located Patrice's number. On a Tuesday afternoon, she made the call. She told me her heart was practically leaping out of her chest. Orch. I don't want to put you in a tough position, Patrice, Sabrina said, using a pleading tone she never would have used before. It's just, I know there have been documents moving around since Mr. Kingsley passed. For Emmett's sake, I just need to understand what's happening. Patrice didn't answer right away. Sabrina said she could hear the woman weighing her options on the other end. Orch. I truly cannot discuss confidential client files, Patrice said with extreme caution. It was the tone of someone torn between professional loyalty and wanting to help a soul who sounded completely lost. I can't tell you if a document exists, if it's been modified, or if there is anything at all. I hope you understand. It's not out of coldness. Orch. It's just that I have no authority to speak on it from any angle. I understand, it's just, nobody is telling Emmett the truth and it's tearing him apart. I hear you and I'm sorry he's going through that. Patrice's voice softened slightly, but her boundary remained firm. Huibao, but I absolutely cannot confirm or imply any piece of the puzzle. Orch. If I start answering yes or no regarding the existence of files, I am still exposing proprietary business information. I won't do it, Sabrina told me, her chest tightened when she heard that. Orch. It wasn't because a secret had been confirmed, but rather the opposite. Patrice's absolute refusal to cross the line, made her realize the matter was massive enough that a veteran legal staff member wouldn't dare take a single risk. "Is there anyone who can give me a hint?" Sabrina asked, desperate. "George. There is exactly one person with the authority to decide what you get to know," Patrice said deliberately. "And it isn't me. If you want answers, you have to go straight to Mrs. Kingsley. Whatever she chooses to share is her prerogative, not mine." Sabrina thanked her and hung up. George. She told me she sat there with the phone on her lap for a long time, processing the chilling reality that her searching had led right back to how heavily protected the secret truly was. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was standing on the edge of a massive depth that went far beyond a canceled wedding, or a quilt tossed into a trash can. She didn't call Emmett that night either. George. Instead, she started wondering how she was going to face me. That Friday, Sylvester's office called me in for a meeting. They needed to review a few details regarding equity management in person. I dressed meticulously, as if entering a courtroom, because, in a way, this was a trial. George. His office sat on the fourth floor of a downtown building with heavy mahogany doors, the walls lined with Ivy League law, degrees arranged like armor. I had stepped into this room more times than I could count over the last 3 years, but today felt different. The air was heavy. "Lois," Sylvester said, rising to motion me into the leather chair across from his wide desk. "George, I want to verify the timeline once more to ensure every single action remains aligned with Richard's original intent." "Of course," I said, my voice steady. "Emmett must be married. The core condition hasn't changed. What else needs verification?" Sylvester opened a thick manila folder and slid a page toward me. "George, you've been aware of the 90-day limitation Richard established in this agreement from day one. The final equity transfer and execution must occur within 90 days of Emmett's legal marriage. If that window closes without execution, the shares automatically trigger his secondary clause." I had reviewed that clause countless times over the past 3 years. I could recite it in my sleep. George. But sitting here, less than 3 weeks after the wedding collapsed, hearing those cold legal terms read aloud carried a much heavier weight. "What kind of secondary clause?" I asked, looking for formal confirmation. George. "If the 90 days expire without execution, the shares automatically transfer into a trust where the sole beneficiaries are the core executive management team," Sylvester said, looking straight at me. Richard was thorough. George. He wanted to ensure that if things didn't go according to plan, actual control of the business would stay with the people capable of protecting its operations, rather than getting tied up in litigation. I sat there as my mind quickly ran the math, though it wasn't a complex equation. Emmett wasn't married. Not yet. George. The unforgiving countdown clock Richard set in his final wishes hadn't even started ticking, and I was still holding on to this secret entirely alone. A secret that required a marriage to unlock. A marriage that had completely dissolved 3 weeks ago. "I know what the paperwork says, Sylvester." I kept my voice level and calm, hiding the storm inside. "George, I just didn't expect to be recalculating this timeline based on a canceled wedding. That is exactly why I asked you to come in today. I want to make sure you clearly understand the level of urgency we are racing against now that the timeline has been disrupted." I gave a slow, heavy nod. Once he remarried, 90 days. George. That wasn't an endless stretch of time. It was a narrow window that would begin to close the moment Emmett took a vow, if he ever took one at all. "The execution proceeds exactly as Richard drafted it," I stated firmly. "No modifications and absolutely no disclosure to anyone ahead of time. When the timing is right, everything follows his rules." "Understood," Sylvester said, closing the folder. "George, I just want to ensure you carry that urgency with you, rather than simply tracking the clauses." When I walked out of that office, a heavy weight settled in my chest. A sense of approaching a boundary I hadn't felt in this way before. And Fenwick was waiting for me right in the parking garage. Sylvester's building shared a garage with 2 other corporate entities downtown. George. I found out later that Fenwick had a cousin working as a receptionist 2 floors down. With those kinds of local connections, he didn't need a private investigator. Just a quick phone call and a solid guess allowed him to corner me right by my car. "Lois," he said, stepping out from the shadows to match my pace. "I hear you were up in Sylvester's office today. You're well informed." Porch. "I am finished waiting around for you to offer information." The mask of concern finally slipped, revealing a crack. "I've already spoken with 2 senior members of the board. Yes, it won't be a legally binding vote because everyone knows the shares you hold aren't public stock." Porch. The still has the authority to call for a formal financial review of any assets impacting executive leadership transitions. And enough of us are uncomfortable enough with the silence that we've decided to formally call for that review next month. "A review doesn't mean you hold the cards, David," I said, looking at him coldly. "No," he smiled sharply, "but it means pressure. Porch. And pressure always has a way of making people talk." I stopped walking, turned around, and looked him dead in the eye, with a gaze cold enough to freeze. "Then I guess I will see you at the board meeting next month, David." He stared at me for a few seconds, verifying there was zero retreat in my expression, before turning on his heel and walking toward his car in a tight rage. Porch. Standing alone in the dim garage with my car keys gripped tightly in my hand, I could hear an invisible clock ticking down in a very real, aggressive way. That Sunday afternoon, Sabrina appeared on my porch without warning. No notice, no phone call. I opened the door, froze for a second, and just looked at her. Porch. It was the look you give an unexpected complication you weren't prepared to face so soon. "Mrs. Kingsley." Her voice sounded smaller and more humble than I had ever heard it. "I know I have absolutely no right to be standing here, but I have to ask you something. It's a question I can't take to anyone else." I didn't invite her in immediately. Porch. I let her stand on the weathered porch mat for a moment, letting her feel the weight of showing up uninvited at a home she wouldn't have bothered to visit before the split. "Come inside," I said finally, stepping aside. She sat on the edge of the older sofa in my living room, her posture rigid as a stone, hands twisting tightly in her lap. Porch. The calm, superior attitude of a woman who thought the world owed her comfort was completely missing. "I spoke with someone who used to work with your attorney," she said, swallowing hard as she spoke. "I know I shouldn't have been looking into things, but nobody will tell Emmett what's going on, and it's driving him crazy. I need to know what kind of situation I walked into." Porch. "And what did you find out?" I looked down at her. "Nothing substantial." She looked up, her eyes pleading. "Just that. Mr. Kingsley modified some legal documents toward the end, after he became ill." I took a seat in the armchair across from her, crossing my hands over my lap in the exact same manner. I let a heavy silence fill the room, stretching it to its absolute limit before answering. Porch. "Yes," I said. "He did." Her breath caught sharply. "Can you tell me what it is?" "No," my voice carried zero warmth. "Not right now. I can't even tell my own son the full picture yet." She nodded slowly. It looked like an answer she had expected, yet a part of her had desperately hoped for a different outcome. Porch. I keep replaying that night in my head. Her voice grew softer, carrying a slight tremor. "The way you reached into that trash can to take the quilt back. I called it strange. I even spent weeks laughing about it with people." Her voice caught in her throat. "I had no idea there was actual weight behind it. To me, it was just an old wool blanket. It was never just a blanket." Porch. "Never," I said coldly. "I see that now." She wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand, looking embarrassed by the display of vulnerability. "When everything fell apart, my own parents barely even called to check on me. Their only concern was how embarrassing the situation was at the country club." Porch. "These past few days, all I can think about is you walking to that trash can in front of everyone. You didn't care what anyone thought. You only cared about protecting what was yours." I watched her in silence for a long time. For 3 whole years, I had carried this massive secret completely alone, fighting in the dark. Porch. And now, the very woman who had thrown my hard work into the garbage and insulted me in front of high society was sitting in my living room, realizing the sacred weight of that quilt sooner and deeper than my own son, even if she still had no idea what was actually inside it. "I didn't come here to ask for anything today," she said, taking a deep breath. "George, I just needed you to know that I finally understand. I know the severity of what I did that night, and the massive cost of it. Understanding it doesn't mean you've fixed it," I said. The tone wasn't sharp, but it cut straight to the point. "I know." She stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt with hands that were still shaking slightly. "George, I wanted you to hear that directly from me, not through Emmett. I should go." After she left, I sat alone in the quiet living room, feeling a strange irony. The woman whose vanity and arrogance had nearly broken our family was now the first person to touch the edge of the truth. As Sabrina walked toward her Lexus in the driveway, her steps were much heavier than when she arrived. George. But her mind was moving fast, already calculating her next step. This time, it wasn't for Emmett, it was for me. Following that Sunday meeting, I didn't see Sabrina for nearly 2 weeks. But she later shared how she spent those days. I fully believed her because a unique, quiet focus remains in a person's voice after they've been truly refined by regret. George. She said she couldn't stop replaying the rehearsal dinner. Not the version she had shared with her friends to mock me, but the harsh reality she had been too proud to face at the time. What finally pushed her from reflection into action was a chance encounter. 10 days after calling Patrice, she ran straight into Emmett's Aunt Josephine at a CVS pharmacy prescription counter on the edge of town. George. In the South, a traditional woman of Josephine's generation doesn't mince words. She wasn't malicious, but her directness was enough to make anyone look down. "You know," Josephine said, not even looking Sabrina in the eye, just staring at her prescription slip. Lois didn't make a scene that night. She just quietly took her gift and left with her dignity intact. George. That is not a woman who acts without purpose. Whatever you thought you saw, young lady, you missed the entire point. Sabrina said that after Aunt Josephine left with her medicine, she stood under the cold, white fluorescent lights of the pharmacy, gripping her shopping bag for a long time. George. It felt like a bystander had just reached out and slammed the exact realization she had been avoiding right onto her face. She remembered the light, catching her expensive diamond bracelet, and how easily she had flipped that quilt into the garbage. She remembered turning right back to her champagne like nothing had happened. George. It wasn't until Josephine's words hit home that she forced herself to recall the entire sequence of me walking to the trash can. Steady. Composed. No tears, no scream-sing match. She clearly recalled how I lifted the quilt with both hands, handling it with an extreme care, as if it weren't just fabric, but an invaluable asset worth defending at all costs. George. She told me she used to think that reaction was bizarre, like an act for attention. Now she finally saw that it wasn't bizarre at all. It was restraint, an untouchable dignity that was the exact opposite of the shallow behavior she had displayed all night. That evening, she went back to her apartment and looked at the piles of wedding gifts completely differently. George. They weren't leftovers from a canceled event anymore. She saw the care people took in selecting them, the same way I must have spent endless nights stitching that quilt together. She considered calling Patrice again but decided against it. Patrice had made her boundaries clear, and pushing further would only force the woman to cross a line she was protecting. George. Whatever the truth was, Sabrina now understood there was only one person with the authority to give it. She thought about calling Emmett too, but she held back. It wasn't time. Whatever she owed Emmett, she had to repair what she had broken somewhere else first. George. That same night, she opened her large walk-in closet, pulled out the expensive designer gown she had worn to the rehearsal dinner, looked at it for a long moment, and then packed it away into the deepest corner. She decided that from that moment on, she didn't need anyone's permission to step up and set this right on her own terms. This time, Sabrina called ahead. Porch. She said she only needed 15 minutes and promised not to stay long. I told her to come over that Thursday evening. When she stood on my porch again, her posture was a bit straighter than before, even though her hands were still twisting nervously at her sides. I did something before coming here, she said directly, as soon as she sat down across from me. Porch. Before we talk about anything else, I need you to know. Go ahead, I said, watching her. My mother called again this week. She's still hysterically trying to manage the public fallout at the country club. I told her, for the first time in my life, that I don't care how embarrassing this looks for the family. She looked right into my eyes, her voice clear and steady. Porch. I told her exactly what happened that night. I told her I threw a gift a mother spent months stitching into the trash and called it garbage in front of everyone. I told her the wedding didn't end because Emmett was too sensitive or insecure. It ended entirely because of me. I examined her face, keeping my silence. She completely lost it. Sabrina continued, a bitter smile touching her lips. Porch. She screamed that I was dragging our family through the mud and making myself look 100 times worse. I told her she could say whatever she wanted, but I didn't care. And I meant it. That takes a certain amount of courage, I said quietly. Even if that courage arrived a bit late. She lowered her head, looking at her hands. Mrs. Porch. Kingsley, I didn't come here tonight to ask for your forgiveness, or to try and win Emmett back. I came to apologize, not just for the quilt, but for the person I was that night, and probably for the person I've been for a very long time. She took a deep breath. I dismissed things just because they didn't come with an expensive price tag. Porch. I looked down on people because they didn't waste money the way my family does. I treated you like you were invisible and minimized your effort, because it was the easiest thing for me to do. Putting you down made me feel superior. Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to keep going. I don't expect you to forgive me tonight. I just needed to say these words to you face to face. Porch. And I needed to make sure this apology came with a cost, by standing up to my mother and breaking the pattern, rather than just picking nice words to put on a show. I let the silence stretch over the room for a long time. Just as I always did when a matter carries immense weight, you cannot rush it. An apology doesn't put something broken back together. I finally said, my voice as calm as water. Porch. It doesn't put that quilt back in your hands undamaged, and it doesn't erase the look of total defeat on my son's face that night, or over this past month. I paused, watching the hope fade from her eyes. But, I continued, shifting my tone, it is a start. She snapped her head up, her eyes shining with tears. This time she didn't rush to hide them or wipe them away. Porch. That is much more than I expected to receive, she whispered. I didn't say you received everything, I corrected. I said it's a start. There is a massive difference between the two. Hearing that, a tiny cautious smile appeared on her face. It was as if she fully grasped the heavy gravity behind my words. We sat there for a bit longer. Porch. The atmosphere in the room turned quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that finally emerges after the harshest, most painful truths have been laid completely bare. Right before she stood up to leave, I stopped her. Sabrina. She turned back to face me. There is something Emmett still doesn't know, I said, spacing out every word as I locked eyes with her. Porch. Something much larger than any of the trouble either of you can imagine right now. Her gaze turned incredibly sharp as she searched my face for information. I'm not ready to reveal the truth just yet, I said, standing up like a general preparing for a long campaign. Phew. But I think it is time for both of you to start preparing for what happens when it comes to light. Porch. Sabrina slowly sat back down on the sofa, her legs seemingly losing their strength. Though she kept her mouth shut and didn't ask a single question, the sheer shock and curiosity were written plainly across her face. The special board meeting was set for Monday morning at 10 o'clock. Porch. When I walked into that spacious executive conference room, the calm mask I wore was the exact same one from the night I pulled the quilt out of the trash can. Sylvester, my attorney, walked by my side, carrying the briefcase that held the decisive documents. Emmett was already seated at the far end of the massive mahogany table. Porch. After hearing that Fenwick had forced an item onto the agenda to clarify equity shifts regarding the late founder's estate, Emmett had pushed back against everyone and insisted on attending. As Sylvester and I entered, Fenwick stood up from his leather executive chair. Porch. He deliberately adjusted the button on his suit jacket, carrying a level of overinflated confidence that didn't belong in that room. Thank you all for making the time today. Fenwick cleared his throat, addressing the 7 board members seated around the table. For weeks, I have been deeply concerned about unexplained movements regarding Richard Kingsley's shares. Mrs. Porch. Kingsley has refused to clarify anything directly. I believe this board has a right to absolute transparency before any equity transfers are finalized behind closed doors. A few people around the table gave slight nods. It was clear Fenwick had done his homework, quietly gathering enough allies to pull off this ambush. I am formally asking Mrs. Porch. Kingsley to explain to the board, he continued, turning a challenging gaze toward me. Exactly what plans are being made in secret, and does current management have any say in the direction of this company? Every eye in the room instantly locked onto me. I didn't stand up right away. I let the intense pressure of the silence hang in the air for a moment. Porch. It's a strategy that never fails. When you have something massive to declare, you must first make the entire room hold its breath. David's concern isn't entirely without merit. I finally spoke, my voice completely level. He gave 20 years to this company and he wants a clear answer. So, I am here today to give him, and everyone at this table, exactly what he asked for. Porch. I looked around the room. I could have explained this weeks ago to avoid wasting my time with these meetings. The only reason I didn't is because the moment I say the word "Sayers" in a room like this, my son would have heard the news from someone else rather than from me. And I will never risk my son's trust for anything. Porch. Sylvester opened his briefcase right on cue, sliding several copies of a document across the smooth table to the directors. My husband's will, I raised my voice, making sure each word landed firmly, includes a specific clause regarding his personal equity. This document was drafted and notarized after his diagnosis, while he was in a completely sound legal state of mind. Porch. Those shares were left entirely to me as an unconditional inheritance, but it came with a personal directive. Not a legal obligation, but his final wish as a father. He wanted me to transfer those shares into our son's name after Emmett was legally married, serving as Richard's foundation for his son's future. I paused, letting the weight of the revelation sink into the room. Porch. Then, I turned a freezing glare toward Fenwick. That clause never required board approval, I said, spacing out each word. Because those shares were never part of the public operations of this company. That was Richard's personal holding, and he had every right to leave it to whomever he pleased. Porch. If anyone wants to challenge the validity of this document, Sylvester is prepared to offer full legal confirmation right now. Sylvester maintained a flawless professional smile and nodded. The will is airtight. Mrs. Kingsley is acting entirely within her legal rights, following the exact timeline established by her late husband. Fenwick's jaw clenched instantly, his face turning entirely pale. Porch. Then what was with all the secrecy? He spat back, his voice rising as he lost control. You spent weeks avoiding questions, allowing doubt to spread through the company, leaving everyone wondering who actually belongs in executive leadership. That's secrecy. I cut him off sharply, my voice quiet but completely commanding. Is my personal right, David. Porch. Because until I was ready to announce it, you had absolutely no business knowing it. I stood up, pressing my hands flat on the desk, looking down at him. For the past few weeks, you've been dropping hints that my son doesn't deserve his position. Let me tell you something. He built his entire career with his own 2 hands through 12 years of hard labor. Porch. Perhaps instead of acting like a wild dog chasing private shares that are none of your business, you should spend your energy reflecting on your own limitations and why you feel the need to destroy a young man who gave 12 dedicated years to this firm just to mask your own failing ambition. The conference room fell into a dead silence. Porch. A few of the older board members exchanged uncomfortable looks. Fenwick opened his mouth to argue, but found absolutely no ground to stand on, finally shutting his mouth in embarrassment. I believe the most senior board member spoke up cautiously, breaking the quiet. The matter is entirely clear. Mrs. Kingsley's actions are fully compliant and proper. This agenda item is concluded. Which? Fenwick sank back into his chair in silence, completely deflated. I watched coldly as the false alliance he tried to build against me fell apart publicly right in front of him. I turned my eyes toward Emmett at the other end of the table. He was staring straight at me. It was a look that told me he was truly seeing me for the first time in his life. Porch. He no longer saw a weak widow crushed by grief who only made quilts. He saw a strong woman who had held the line entirely alone for 3 years, and who had just shattered a conspiracy right in front of everyone who doubted him. The day after the board meeting, Emmett came to my house. He sat down at the kitchen table, the exact spot where the quilt had been spread out that night. Porch. He told me he wanted to talk about Sabrina. "She's changed," he said, his voice carrying a thoughtful calm. "I don't just mean the apology. I mean she actually stood up to her mother, laid out the ugly truth of what happened that night, and didn't care at all that it made her family look terrible at the country club. Porch. The woman who threw your hard work into the garbage for vanity could never have done that." "People can change," I said, pouring coffee. "But trust cannot be built entirely on nice words." "I know, and I didn't plan on just taking her word for it this time." He told me that on a recent Sunday, they had dropped by his cousin Tanya's house without warning to bring some things for the kids. Porch. Tanya's financial situation was tight. She lived in an older, low-income duplex on the east side of town, the living room carpet worn and cheap plastic toys scattered everywhere. It was a place entirely devoid of luxury or status. "If it had been the old Sabrina," Emmett said, "she would have started dropping passive-aggressive hints on the drive over." Porch. She would have made jokes about the neighborhood, or complaints about the size of the house. But this time, she didn't say a single word about any of it. Not only that, but when they stepped into the cramped house, Sabrina, wearing high-end fashion, didn't hesitate to get down on her knees on that stained carpet, spending 20 minutes helping Tanya's youngest daughter put together a cheap puzzle. Porch. She laughed with the child and asked sincere questions, acting as if that 5-year-old's answers were far more important than any business partner's grand strategy. Before they left, Tanya pulled Emmett out to the corner of the porch and whispered, "Listen, that girl is all right. She spent half the day here and didn't look down her nose at my old furniture once." Porch. None of that nasty attitude like she was doing us a favor by showing up. Emmett said those words from Tanya shook him more than any apology Sabrina could ever offer. It wasn't something Sabrina could have staged to impress him. She had no idea what Tanya would say. She was simply becoming a different person naturally. Porch. In a worn-out living room with no influential people and no cameras, she showed real character. After that, they started spending time together again very slowly and cautiously. This time, nobody rushed to put the other on a pedestal. Emmett observed her quietly, not to trap her, but because a part of him desperately wanted to believe. The woman in front of him was real. Porch. Day after day, week after week, her changes held true in the smallest, most unimportant details where there was nothing to gain. 3 months after the board meeting, Emmett told me they decided to remarry. This time, it was incredibly low-key. No 200 guests with hidden agendas, no white peonies flown overnight from 3 states away, and no expensive public relations team. Porch. They simply took their vows before a judge at City Hall and came back to the house I've lived in for 30 years for a modest dinner. Only the family who truly cared attended. No performance, no shallow vanity to uphold. Sabrina wore a simple white, knee-length dress she picked out herself from a regular department store. Porch. No dramatic elements copied from fashion magazines, and no high society expectations to carry. When she stood before Emmett, the look in her eyes was something I had never seen from her before. Steady and completely vulnerable. After the vows and dinner were finished, once most of the relatives had left, Sabrina came into the kitchen alone. I was at the sink washing dishes. Porch. "Thank you," she said softly from behind me. "Thank you for giving me a chance to change." "You earned that yourself," I said, wiping my hands without turning around. "I just didn't slam the door in your face while you were trying to figure it out." She stepped forward and gave me a brief, sincere embrace. Then she turned to go find my son. Porch. That night I watched them walk out the front door hand in hand, their steps lighter than they had been in months. The massive weight I had carried alone in my chest for 3 long years finally settled into place. Just as Emmett followed her out the door, I caught his arm gently. "Come by tomorrow alone," I whispered. "Your father left some things for you, and it's time." Porch. He looked at my face for a long moment, trying to read further, but I gave him no more hints. "See you tomorrow," I repeated, letting go. The next morning, Emmett arrived alone as planned, carrying the peaceful demeanor of a man who had finally settled his life properly. This marriage had no chaos, no trash can humiliation, and no suffocating judgment in a hotel lobby. Porch. When he walked into the kitchen, the quilt was spread out neatly across the table, the exact spot where it had rested the night Sabrina first tossed it away. "Sit down," I said. He pulled out a chair. His focus was entirely locked on the fabric, looking at it as if he were truly seeing it for the first time. Porch. He wasn't just seeing cloth and stitches anymore, but the object itself. The catalyst that had canceled a massive wedding and brought months of pressure and questions. I picked up a sharp pair of sewing scissors and carefully snipped a seam along the edge of the quilt, a section I had stitched shut tightly 3 years ago. Emmett held his breath, watching my movements intently. Porch. Once the seam was fully opened, I reached inside the soft lining with 2 fingers and pulled out 2 items: a flat metal safety deposit box key and a folded letter. The paper of the letter was incredibly soft along the creases because it had spent 3 years resting against warm fabric rather than the cold iron of a safe. Porch. "Your father wrote this the year he first became ill," I said, sliding both items across the table toward him. "He made me swear that unless you were truly married, not just standing at an altar going through the motions, but truly understanding what a marriage means, I could never hand it over to you." Emmett's hands shook noticeably as he picked up the letter. Porch. He looked up at me, seeking permission. I gave him a silent nod. He sat alone at the table and began to read. I turned my back to him, facing the counter, giving him the absolute privacy he needed to face his father's spirit in his own kitchen. Halfway through, I heard him let out a heavy breath. Porch. He stopped, sitting entirely still as the paper trembled slightly in his hand before he forced himself to keep reading. When he finally reached the last word, he sat rigid as a statue, remaining silent for a long time. He said he was sorry. Emmett finally spoke, his voice incredibly raspy and thick. "For everything." Porch. "For the birthdays he missed, and the Sunday family dinners he always skipped for work." His voice caught again, and he swallowed hard. He said watching me build my career entirely on my own was the only right thing he ever did for me as a father, even if he did it out of selfishness and obsession with his company at the time. Porch. He said he would never hand anything over easily until he saw me build something he never managed to create: a real marriage and a real home. That key, I turned around to face him, belongs to a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown. Inside are all his personal shares in the firm. It was always meant for you. Porch. It's yours, from the day you finally established the life he couldn't build. Emmett looked down at the key resting in his palm. The weight of that metal felt 100 times heavier than a gold mine in that moment. Right then, Sabrina, who had been waiting quietly in the living room, walked to the kitchen doorway. Emmett motioned for her to come over. She stepped up beside his chair. Porch. Emmett didn't hide the paper. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and looked over it, reading the final words of the letter alongside him. I stood by, watching the color leave her face as she read, seeing the shock in her eyes turn into a profound reverence. I watched her finally reach the very core of a truth she had nearly destroyed without ever knowing its value. Porch. This, she whispered, staring at the letter and the key, her voice like a dream. It was hidden inside this whole time when I called it a cheap scrap? Yes, I looked into her eyes. I told you it wasn't cruel. It was just the reality. This time, she didn't offer a single word of defense. She simply reached out and gripped Emmett's hand tightly as he held the letter. Porch. The two of them sat close together at that old kitchen table, the letter open between them, while the metal key reflected the bright morning light through the window. I took a step back, watching my son accept both the deep sorrow and the ultimate grace his father left behind. Porch. I watched the woman who had once treated a sacred object like garbage finally comprehend the weight of what cannot be secreted. Some things in this world are hidden deeply away, not to keep you locked out. They are hidden simply because you need time to grow, until you are truly ready to carry their weight.